Hey folks, Abel here, and we are continuing with these unscripted, kind of spontaneous videos. Definitely today I want to talk about something which I wouldn't do an entire podcast episode on, but nevertheless, it's a really good question which has come on a couple of times over the course of these past few weeks, and that is the question of how frequently should you train? And by that, in this instance, I don't actually mean how frequently you should be training a given muscle group, but just total time spent in the gym and basically just hitting the gym a certain amount of times. A couple of people asked me this question, and I think it's a good question and something that I haven't quite seen being discussed in the light that I want to discuss it today. Most of the discussions around this just come down to some kind of woo-woo stuff about the optimal days of recovery between sessions or how you have to make sure that you don't overtrain, which are kind of crap for the most part. So in this video, I would just like to focus on the real concrete, kind of no-nonsense aspects of this question. So a couple of things I'm going to assume upon discussing this. One of them is that you are reasonably ambitious about training your entire body. So by that, I don't mean every single muscle group like your forearms and then whatever upper pec, lower pec, not like that, but that you don't have entire parts of your body that you're just not interested in training whatsoever. So for example, you're not a guy who is just not interested in training legs on the whole. So that's one thing I'm going to assume. Another thing I'm going to assume is that you're willing to train most of your muscle groups at least twice a week. So you're not just doing a bro split, because in that case, the question is very simple. You should probably be in the gym at least 5 or maybe 6 times a week, depending on how you split it up. Otherwise, you're probably not going to be able to train each of your muscle groups 1 day a week. And with that, basically what I want to start off with is that this question mainly comes down to a couple of practical considerations. And it really comes down to how can you distribute your overall weekly volume for each of your muscle groups in a way that's, well, for one, it actually allows you to get in all the volume for your muscle groups and you're not constantly forced to skip exercises and skip doing some of the volume for your body parts because of time management issues, session length and whatnot. And also, how can you distribute your volume in a fashion that will allow you to perform pretty high quality work for all of the exercises and movements that you want to perform for your muscle groups? So we in exercise and fitness generally take a stance that weekly workout volume is a lot more important than training frequency and how you distribute your work volume. And that's true to a large extent, but it kind of assumes that you're not doing something stupid. For example, imagine going in the gym only 1 day a week and having a 7 or 8 hour workout and you get in all of your volume for all the muscle groups on that given day. You obviously can feel that that's kind of ridiculous. Someone might say, well, but you get in all your weekly workout volume for each of your muscle groups, but nobody would probably agree or disagree with the fact that you would do better had you distributed all of that volume over the course of multiple sessions, even if that would have resulted in a bro split, because you would have performed a larger percentage of your overall workload in a more refreshed and less fatigued state. And I would say that 6 or maybe 7 exercises or movements per session and 20 to 25 working sets per session is a pretty good rule of thumb. It's not a completely set in stone rule. It's not completely unbreakable, but it's definitely a general good rule of thumb to stick to. And with that, I would say that there are basically 2 main determinants of how many sessions a week is going to be optimal for you. One of them is how advanced you are, so your training age, and under the same breath, I would say how much volume is optimal for you or is going to be more likely to be beneficial for you. And secondly, how perfectionist or how picky you are with your exercise selection and counting volume from different movements towards one muscle group or another. So just to briefly elaborate on both of these, if you are a beginner or a brand newbie in the gym, then you're more than likely to benefit from a pretty low amount of volume, maybe as low as 6 to 8 sets per muscle group per week. And if that's the case, there's absolutely no reason why you couldn't cram all of that into 3 sessions. In fact, you could do 4 or 5 sessions as well, but we actually might end up in a situation where we need to design your workouts just so that you can actually be in the gym 4 or 5 days a week, not so much that you need to be in the gym 4 or 5 days a week to actually distribute all of your workout volume over the course of the week equally. On the other hand, if you're an intermediate or later stage intermediate lifter, you could still be in the gym 3 days a week, but you're more likely to run into practical problems. For example, session length, or just performing a large percentage of your workout volume in a not very fresh state. The second point, which is the how big of a perfectionist you are point, is a little bit more tricky to understand, but I'll try to explain it relatively simply. If you're of a mindset where you have a pretty minimalistic outlook on training, and you will say things like, I'm counting volume from my squats as effective volume for my calves because there is some calf involvement in squatting patterns, or I'm counting volume from my pull downs or rows towards my rear delts and my biceps, for example, which you definitely should do to some extent, because there's no question that your calves do get involved from squats, or that your biceps and your rear delts get trained from pull downs. But if you're more of a stickler, you're more of a perfectionist, and you're more picky about your exercise selection, then you will want to make sure that you will do some dedicated work for your rear delts and your calves. So to give some concrete examples here, let's take a beginner who can benefit from maybe 6 to 8 sets per week per muscle group, and that person might have a workout setup which consists of the following movements: a squatting pattern, a hip hinge pattern, a bench press or some other horizontal push, an overhead press or some other shoulder press, a pull down, a row, a calf raise, and he will do 3 or 4 sets for each of these, multiply all of that by 2. So he will be performing all of those movements or some movement like that twice a week. Throw in maybe 1 or 2 isolation movements to round up the volume for maybe shoulders and arms. And that's it. And then we are talking about maybe 15 or 16 movements per week in total. And like I said, that's perfectly doable in 3 sessions a week. If we are talking about an intermediate lifter, and that lifter is not incredibly picky about his exercise selection, then his training setup might still look like that of a beginner in the sense that maybe he will do all of these movements. So squat pattern, hip hinge pattern, calf raise, pull down, row, bench press, overhead press, multiply all of these by 2. He will do maybe 4 sets for each of these, multiply that by 2, and then another couple of isolation work for delts, arms, calves. But if he has a more minimalistic outlook on all of this, then he will say, well, I just did 8 sets of squats. That is 8 sets of calf work. I just did 8 sets of lat pull downs or chin ups or some vertical pull, as well as 8 sets of rows. That's, at least 12 sets of bicep work, 12 sets of lat work, 12 sets of rear delt work. My bench presses will cover maybe 8 sets of pec work. Front delts will definitely get plenty of work, but who the hell really counts front delt work on a hypertrophy program? Triceps definitely get stimulated plenty from the shoulder presses and bench presses. So that person might still only throw on top of all of this a couple of isolation movements, a little bit more than a beginner, but still not too much. And at the end of the week, we're talking about maybe 18, 20, 22 movements in total. And that is completely doable in 4 sessions a week. 3 sessions might still work okay, but then, we're again kind of running into practical issues. So then we're looking at 7 or 8 exercises or movements per workout, which is not the end of the world, but maybe not the most practical. So 4 sessions might work better. Now, if this same person is a lot more picky, then he will say, there's no way I'm counting all my squat work as effective calf work, or there's no way I'm going to count my lat pull downs as effective rear delt work, and overhead presses suck for the side delts. So I'm going to be damn sure that I'm performing side raises, face pulls, reverse flies, a lot of calf work, dedicated tricep work. Rows and pull downs are not very effective for the biceps, so I'm going to be doing at least 10 to 12 sets of direct bicep work. And with that kind of an outlook, we're quickly getting to the territory where we're looking at up to 30 movements per week. And that is doable-ish in 4 days, but again, 7 or 8 exercises per session. It's not the end of the world, but you're more likely to perform some part of your workouts in a suboptimally fatigued state. So we will have to be pretty smart with shifting exercises around within any given session so that you make sure that the exercises that you're not going to be performing in a very fresh state are not so important to you on the whole. So maybe 5 sessions might work a bit more practical, and 3 sessions is pretty much out of the window because, I mean, 10 movements per session and performing up to 30 sets per session, it's kind of ridiculous. It's doable, but it's definitely not optimal. And by the way, I'm not even necessarily saying that one outlook is necessarily better than the other, because there are some people with very low volume thresholds whose muscles just respond to a relatively low level or low amount of stimulus that for them, you know, if they do rows and lat pull downs, that is plenty of stimulation for their rear delts. And if they did a whole bunch of dedicated isolation work for those muscle groups, then it might flat out be too much. Whereas for other people, like me, for example, I just don't have such a low volume threshold. I actually don't respond to a ton of volume, but definitely not so low that I could get away with not performing any isolation work for these. So, for example, I've been doing shoulder presses for ages and nothing else. And definitely when I started doing a lot more isolation work for my side delts, that's when they really started to show some decent development. So it kind of depends on who you are as a person, and you kind of have to know thyself in that regard. And I would say that in general, 4 to 6 hours of lifting per week and 4 to 5 sessions a week is pretty good for most intermediate to late stage intermediate lifters who are pretty ambitious about their exercise selection and their training, and definitely have a more of a better safe than sorry kind of outlook on how they structure their training and select their exercises. And I would also say that practical life considerations definitely have a role here. So to use my own personal example, I'm definitely very picky about how I'm putting together my workouts. I have a good amount of variety in exercise selection, both to optimize hypertrophy, but also to avoid overuse injuries and the like. And something happened over this past year, which I actually never anticipated before, which is that I just stopped enjoying my current gym environment. So in the city that I'm living in, I'm pretty much using the best gym that we have available here. And I just don't like the personnel in that gym. I don't like being there. And whenever I go to that gym, I just have this weird feeling in my stomach of, I want to procrastinate over this. And given how much I love training and enjoy the process of training, because to me, this is really an undertaking of personal development, I can trust myself enough to know that that is good enough of a reason to take this into consideration. So for that reason, I have a general schedule where I'm working from Monday to Saturday, and I have 4 scheduled workouts. And if I have the time and convenience, and if I skipped some exercises over the course of the week for some body parts that are not as important to me, for example, my calves, then I will go down on Sundays as well, and I will do an extra optional session on Sunday. So that's how I'm structuring my training, and it doesn't have to do as much with what's optimal, although 4 sessions is definitely perfectly fine, but it's more so a general personal preference and real life consideration. So that would be my conclusion. How much volume is going to be optimal for you is a big consideration. How big of a stickler you are is also a consideration. And also real life considerations are to be taken into account. And 4 or 5 sessions per week for most people is a pretty good sweet spot. So that would be this video for today. Well, let me know once again what you thought of this video. And my question for you today is, how many days you are in the gym and what is your rationale for doing that? And also, how many movements and exercises you perform for each muscle group.